Hello, welcome to Made by Night. Today we're doing paper lanterns. This is the build that we're going to be doing, and the reason that I think that this is valuable is because it's fast, it's really cheap, and the structure is highly adaptable to many different situations. If you can nail the basics of this structure down, you can adapt it to all sorts of different occasions in the house, and really it helps to change the mood of rooms, especially in the evenings. The great thing about this is that all of the materials are really cheap, which means that you can experiment and play with it and change it, and you don't have to be precious with them. So I'll show you a few different examples so that you can get an idea about the adaptability and the malleability of this structure, and so that you can see the directions you can take it. This is another really basic example. As you can see, it's basically just a square truss. And then you just sort of wrap it in the tissue paper like I've done with the other one. This one is really fast to do, and I like it because it's quite simple and elegant. This differs from the other one in that it comes in two parts like this, almost like a traditional lamp, and it's quick and easy to make. This is the third example. It's a lot like the first one. The difference here, though, is, as you can see, it doesn't have the rocks on the bottom, which means it has a much higher center of gravity. And because it's got a triangular base, that means it's got a sort of inherent instability to it. I prefer the structural forms that the wider base produces, but generally it's much easier to do it with the rocks because it means you can have a smaller base, which means that you can put it in places that are tighter. This one is very similar to the second one I showed you. It's basically just a square kind of truss design. The main difference is that the base is made out of cardboard and is probably better quality. The other difference is that I've actually covered the tissue paper a second time with that strange new packing material you get sometimes now. It's like a sort of machine cut paper that acts a little bit like bubble wrap or something. And as you can see inside here, and it's just the same basic form. It's a bamboo frame reinforced with some cardboard, and then you've got your tissue paper, and then your kind of packing paper over the top. I sort of quite like this lamp because it produces a nice mood in certain areas of the house, areas that you don't want to be too bright in the evening. This next lamp is very similar to the build we're doing today. In fact, it's exactly the same in many ways as the build we're producing today, except that once the entirety of the thing was done, I went back and added more triangles over the top of it that are lifted up by a single strut on one corner. And then I've just matched all of those corners so that it produces a kind of three-dimensional rhythm. And that's basically how the lamp you're now seeing was produced. Part of the point of this one is that, you know, once you're finished with your one, if you don't like it very much, you can just start adding to it or taking away or editing it, and through this you can actually make a much more interesting structural form. This part here is just to show you how far you can take a structure like this one if you learn how to make it. It's pretty quick and easy to learn how to do, and once you understand it, you can start to take it to far more complicated forms. You can also make incredibly simple things, and actually sometimes the simplest ones are the best ones. But you can take it to this kind of higher stage where you're producing things that are really complicated, very strong, and just have kind of an interesting sculptural form that can be manipulated to your own needs. And this just shows you the construction process and some of how it turned out. At the end of the video, I'll show you how you can develop your own forms and do a bit of drawing with you, and show you a little bit of 3D modeling that will help you get to this kind of stage of sculpture. But right now I just want to get on with the build process and show you how the basics work. These are all of the materials you need. It was designed to be a group of things that were just really easy to get hold of. So it's just standard tissue paper, PVA glue, Some paper raffia, you get that from like office supply stores. Heat shrink, which you can get from hardware stores, just get a box with a bunch of different sizes in it. And bamboo skewers, which are just your basic things you get at the supermarket. And the other thing there is just a hot glue stick, and you do need a hot glue gun. The last thing you require is actually the cable, like the electronic part, and you can buy these on eBay. They're not very expensive, they're about $6 Australian each, and it just comes with the thing that holds the bulb and the switch and the plug. Okay, let's talk tools quickly. You need a pair of pliers. I prefer flush cut because they're more accurate, but whatever you've got hold of. You can use scissors, but they're a bit more difficult. A decent glue gun. Don't go for the really cheap ones. The average ones are okay, and the more expensive ones are well worth the money. I use a lighter for the heat shrink. A steel rule just can be useful generally. You need some sort of knife. You can use a scalpel if you want to. I make my own by gluing a utility knife blade to some bamboo because it gives me a very thin profile, and that's useful. But it's really up to you in regards to knives. A pair of scissors is useful. You probably need those. You definitely need some brushes to use with your PVA glue. And the last thing there is just a soldering iron. Now, you don't need this. You can use the hot end of the glue gun to mold the glue once it's been put on. But the soldering iron makes that process a lot simpler. Just a cheap one, preferably one with a temperature dial so that you can turn it right down. So we start out by just prepping some bamboo skewers. We're going to cut the ends off of them, and then we're going to use our heat shrink to glue them together into a double length bamboo skewer. The reason we do this is because the legs require it to be that length. The way we do this is by paring back the ends so that they're essentially like a half round section, and then we just glue it together with a glue gun. As you can see I'm doing here, I'm just peeling off those end bits and then putting them together. And this just means that we can slide the heat shrink on. Here I'm just cleaning up those glue lines because they do seep out the side a little bit. And then I'm just taking my heat shrink, cutting it to length, and then putting it on. If you don't have heat shrink or don't want to use it, you could bind it with twine, you could bind it with paper raffia, you could just take paper and use PVA to glue it around in a sort of spiral. But it does require an extra element to kind of keep those structural members strong, because I find the glue just isn't enough to stop it from breaking at that join point. So that's all I'm doing here, and I'll just skip forward to the next part. Okay, here all I'm doing is I've put the heat shrink on, and I'm using a lighter to heat it up and make it shrink down to size. The next part is just using a larger piece of heat shrink to bind the three legs together into a bundle of three, essentially. And you can see me just doing that there. The next part is that I'm just putting some paper raffia around these rocks and gluing it on so that it stays in place. And then I just glue it to the bottom of the legs. And you can just see how I do that here. And yeah, I have a problem with my glue gun. It clogged up. And I forget what the problem with it was. I think it was just that I had left the glue stick in for too long and it had started to warp and didn't work. So I changed my nozzle and I played around, but I'll just skip through this bit. Okay, I fixed the glue gun, so I'm just continuing on with this. And you just get the paper raffia until you're sort of comfortable with it, and then you put some glue down and glue it up the sides of the legs like this. This can be quite painful, but you know, find your own way to do it. Use a knife to spread it on or whatever. And it's just more of this. And then what we do is we actually put some heat shrink on top of that. And again, you could use what you want. You could just bind it with paper raffia, but you do need that sort of binding element in order to make sure the grip on the rock is nice and tight. So you can see here, all I do is slide it on and then heat it up. And this produces a very sort of strong bond. None of the bottoms of the legs of any of my lamps have fallen off so far, so it seems to work. And any excess paper raffia sticking out the top of that, just trim it off with a knife or a pair of scissors or whatever. Now this bit is the most annoying part of the build by far. All you're doing is trying to get all of the sticks together. So you sort of glue them together, and then you try and get them to splay out, and you get them to splay out by using little bamboo struts or sticks, and then gluing those in after you've got that sort of initial bind done. Some tips for this are actually that using some masking tape to glue the rocks to the tabletop, that really helps. Another thing that can help is, instead of gluing it initially, gluing these different bamboo strands together initially, what you do is you stick them together with masking tape, and that way you can just peel it off. This is a deeply annoying process. It's the most annoying process in the entire build, but it's not very long. It's just a pain in the neck, and you're just sort of starting to develop the structure. But take your time with it, because it does actually matter quite a lot. Okay, now I'm just putting the lamp holder in, and I try and get this in early because it sort of defines the rest of the form. But all you're trying to do is find a place to glue it in, and then you're gluing other sticks around it to kind of solidify its position. And I sort of know it's solid enough when I can't wiggle it too much. So you can just see that here. I'm just gluing sticks in around it, and then gluing those sticks to the lamp. This is actually a fairly easy process in a lot of ways, and you can use your glue gun to just unglue bits and pieces and shift them, and then just re-glue them or whatever. So now I'm sort of quite happy with how well that lamp holder is kind of glued into the structure, and I'm just going around kind of solidifying it a little bit, and then I start to look at the sort of overall structure. And here you're really just sculpting. You're joining all of these strands that you've made together, and you're just trying to get an overall sense of the structure you're producing. This is quite a simple thing. You're just gluing little bits of hot glue to the ends of your sticks, and then finding places to join the structure together. And then once you're kind of happy with that, you're starting to build triangles, because triangles are one of the most sort of structurally sound forms you can make, and that just solidifies the overall structure enormously. As you're going along, you're constantly considering the fact that eventually you're going to have to actually put tissue paper over all of these triangular forms that you're making. So what you're trying to do is make sure each of your triangles are planar. And what that basically means is that all of the points of the triangle exist on a single plane. Now, triangles are naturally planar, but the thing is that when you're building this, you'll find that some triangles have other bits of structure sticking through them. And what you're constantly trying to do is make sure that they don't do that. So say you've got a leg sticking through one of the triangles. You want to find a way to make sure that you can easily stick a piece of tissue paper to that. And the way to do that is to stick extra sticks on so that the triangle is easy to put tissue paper on. And you'll develop a kind of inclination for how easy it is to do that as you go along. It's not particularly difficult to do, but maybe by the time you come to sticking tissue paper to the frame, you'll want to add extra bits and pieces just to make that easier. Okay, so I'm just finishing up that process now. I'm just adding a few extra bits and pieces and kind of tidying things up. Now I've got my soldering iron out, and you can see what I'm doing with it. So basically, all of these connections I've made have little blobs of hot glue on them, and they're kind of ugly, and they do show through the paper when you stick it on. So the best way to deal with this is to either use your hot glue gun or your soldering iron and go around and just sort of mold them and sculpt them into a more kind of elegant form, so that they're not as kind of bulbous and blobby. And this just makes life a lot easier when you're actually putting the tissue paper on, and it makes the end result more attractive once you're done with it. Okay, I've just skipped ahead. I was just doing a little bit of cleanup work on the frame, and now I'm adding the tissue paper, and you can see what I'm doing. I'm just choosing a triangle, cutting a piece that vaguely fits it, and then gluing some PVA to the structure, and then I'm putting the tissue paper on top. And it's just a matter of going around and doing this. I always choose triangles that aren't adjoining, so I don't do them side by side. I do one, cut it, choose one that's not adjoining anything else, glue that one up, and then move to the next one in that manner. And that just gives the glue time to dry, because it's a lot easier to tidy up the fringes if you have let the glue dry sufficiently before trying to do that. And the way that you tidy up the fringes is with a knife. I use a sharp utility knife blade, and that seems to do the job perfectly well. You can see as I'm going along, I'm adding extra struts in, and this just makes it easier to kind of make those kind of planar forms that it's easy to glue tissue paper to. So keep your glue gun on while you're doing this process because it's useful. Here you can see I've just trimmed up that one edge and then put the next one on. And this is how you trim it. That's the bamboo knife that I described before. It's just made with a utility blade. And I just find that it's the best knife that I can find to do this kind of job, because it allows you to get in at strange angles. And it's nice and sharp, so it does this job quite well. This is quite an enjoyable process. Out of all of them, this is the thing that I enjoy the most. There's something sort of strangely enjoyable about cutting those lines clean. And I'm just continuing around and getting on with this process. The glue dries fairly quickly, so this process doesn't actually take that long and is quite enjoyable. And basically what you're doing is when you put the thing on, you can see there, I'm just stretching it out so that the sheet is taut. And as the glue dries, it seems to stretch it out a little bit more. It's a good idea to fold the corners up on adjoining faces so that it doesn't glue to the flat of another panel. So the last thing to do is really just to produce a door. I put my doors above the light bulb because it just makes it easier to get hold of it and to pull it out and in. The door needs to be big enough obviously for the light bulb in your hand. And here I'm just making a little structure. You can do a similar thing if you want to. There must be 100 ways of producing a door, but I just make a triangular frame and then I make a triangular prism on top of that frame. And you can see what I'm doing here. I actually decided that this isn't tall enough because I sort of want to make it more of a sculptural form, so I clip it off and make a bigger one. But you can do it however you want to. The easiest way to make a hinge is just to use a piece of tissue paper, and these seem to be strong enough because they don't take a lot of pressure really. Another way to do it is just to sew it in with a needle and thread, and if you do that I suggest you just use a white piece of thread because that way it's not as noticeable. And here I'm just making it in exactly the same manner as I've made everything else. You just glue the tissue paper on, cut it off and then continue. Okay, so I've just left that aside to dry, and here you can see I'm just finishing up all of the edges of the adjoining forms, and all you're doing is putting a bit of PVA glue in there and then flattening it out. This is a really important process. It makes the final object look much more complete if you get this right. It's not very hard to do, you just go around all of the edges and sort of brush them down. One thing I would say here is if you're not happy with how it looks when it's finished, what you have to do is wait for the glue to dry entirely because it makes an enormous difference. So here I'm just doing exactly the same thing with the door. Okay, now I'm just going to put the door on top. I'm just finishing up those last little bits and pieces. This process takes a little while, but it's not too bad. So I'm putting the door where I want it, and then I'm just making a hinge exactly like that. And all I'll do is glue it down, and then I'll just trim it up. So that's as complicated as the hinge actually needs to be. Because it sits on top, it doesn't fold open when it's sitting stationary. So it doesn't really need anything else. You can put a catch on if you want, but I don't think it's necessary. The last of it is just finishing it up, cleaning it up, and just finishing all of those minor details so that it looks complete. In the next section, I'm just going to talk about some tips and tricks about how you can take this further. And, you know, if you don't like what you've produced, how to kind of change it in order to make it feel more like the thing that you want it to be. So, during the reflection section of this video, instead of talking about the lamp that I've already built, I want to talk about some of the other lamps that I've built and how you can use things like drawing and sculpture and 3D modeling to find more interesting forms and move these ideas from two-dimensional or digital media into three-dimensional form. So I'll just put some photographs up and sort of go through this with you. The lamp you see now actually took me several days to complete and involved components, designing it, drawing it, 3D modeling it, really spending a lot of time in the sort of conceptualization process and then producing it. But I do think that reflection process is really important. Just living with an object for a while in order to kind of see its flaws and decide how you're going to make it more interesting. My problem with this one, I think, was that when I covered it fully, it lost a lot of the feeling of those structural elements from the earlier images, and that really annoyed me. So I need to find a way to kind of bring that back in and make it more interesting. It's also much too large. It's a very big object and it's not practical. But beyond that, I sort of do like it, and I enjoyed the process of making it and designing it and thinking about it, and that's really important. So being somebody who's gone through the process of actually making quite a lot of these things, my advice to you is this. If you're sort of very new to the sort of craft or making or things like that, my advice would be just build one. Follow the guide, build one, learn all those skills, fail, learn to fix your mistakes up, learn what happens when you can't put a panel on correctly and you have to come back later and then re-glue extra pieces on. Learn what it is to experiment and play with things, and just forgive yourself for not doing it perfectly, because you cannot expect that. If that's going to be the thing that stops you from doing it, then don't do it at all. You know, see your failures as learning activities, and try and mark your progress, and notice the fact that your second iteration of it will be much better. If you are a maker and you want to have a go at making your own things, I think I just want to show you some bits and pieces of how I might go about getting into how to relate to structural form like this one, because it's really difficult. You can draw all you want and not necessarily be able to produce that in a structural form. But I do think that making the drawings and doing some 3D models does help you get much closer. This model is in Blender, which is a free software. It's very high quality free software if you're not aware of it. And it's for animation, but it allows you to make 3D models in a way that's very kind of intuitive and direct. And it allows you to play with it and manipulate it and see it in multiple angles and light it. If you do want to learn Blender, the best way to do it is just on YouTube. There are thousands of videos from basic level through to advanced, and the stuff I'm using it for is pretty basic. This is how I use it though. I usually work between drawings and the 3D sculptures until I found something I'm happy with. And I find the drawings really help me to get the three-dimensional form into my mind before I start work producing the thing. Because actually building the thing really takes the most amount of time. So spending a bit of time working out what you actually want to produce before you start producing it is really, really worthwhile. And it's really just about training yourself as to what you're trying to work with, the sorts of forms you're trying to develop, and getting comfortable with those forms before you start making the thing. And it's very difficult to get it sort of one-to-one. This is a real skill and a real art, and I'm only really dabbling at this stage. But as you can see, it does help you enormously, even if your drawings are fairly basic, and even if your knowledge of 3D modeling is again fairly basic. It really does help you to produce higher quality objects once you actually start building them. And as you can see, because I did that initial groundwork, and I really kind of got the thing that I was trying to aim for into my head, it made it much easier to kind of work towards that in a sensible way. My problem with this build, however, was that I actually followed my plan too closely. And I didn't know when to stop, because it took it from something like this, which I really like. I think it's got a good balance between visual simplicity and visual complexity, to this, which I really hate, because I just followed my own idea too closely. If we go back and have a look at the thing that we made today, I actually genuinely really don't like this lamp. Out of all the ones that I've made, this is probably my least favourite one, including the sort of initial bunch of lamps that I made when I was testing it out. But that's the thing that I want to sort of talk about here. Once you've gotten to this stage, it's quite a good stage to be at, because you can look at this in two ways. You can see it as a finished article, and kind of, you know, if you like it, that's up to you. The other way to look at it is like a blank, which you can add to and adapt and change. And that's one of the reasons that I showed you all of the lamps at the beginning, because they all offer different ways and different directions in which you can actually take the one that you've just made. This one, for instance, is just an example of playing with materials. And you know, you can take this in all sorts of directions. You could make a lamp where, you know, one side had maybe tin foil, one side had this kind of packing material, and one side was just the tissue paper. And that way you have a lamp that kind of gives you three different moods depending on which way you turn it. You can also ask questions like, you know, what happens if I put different materials on top of it? How does that change the mood of the lamp? And you can also think about where you want to put it in your house and decide the type of mood you're trying to generate in that space. Or you can go in more of this kind of direction and just start adding to it and changing the form that way. Similarly, you can go in the opposite direction and start cutting pieces out, creating voids in the lamp, adding pieces and taking away from them in order to sort of change it. And if you've got that structural knowledge of how you actually build the thing down, it's a very kind of easy way to play with it and start playing with sculpture and start, you know, building your own ideas. Because it's just a fun thing to kind of mess around with. The other thing is that the thing that you've built is essentially so cheap that you can play around with it, you can have fun with it, you can learn from it, and then do things better next time. But I think I'm going to conclude the video here. So thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, please comment, and tell me what you think. And thank you for watching Made by Night.